So welcome, everyone. My name's Andru Belinsky. I'm running for governor. We've organized this forum on school reopening, and we have some guests who I'll introduce in a second. My goal is to hear from others, to listen to your questions, to hear your suggestions, to listen to our other panelists. I have some well-formed ideas about how to reopen and what's involved, but I really do want to hear from others who have very different experiences than me, and who also speak with other people. So I see we're now live on Facebook. Thank you all for attending. So let me introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to pose an open-ended question that gives us all an opportunity to further introduce ourselves and to talk a little bit about general thoughts on reopening so that we can get the discussion going. So first, at least on my screen, upper left is Amanda Russell. Thanks for waving, that makes it easy. Amanda is both a music teacher at Stratford Elementary, is that right? Oh, I think you're muted.
Stratford School, K-8.
K-8, and Amanda is also the board chair of the Dover School District School Board. I know Amanda because I represented Dover in a suit against the state in 2015 about some funding that was due Dover, and the state had improperly withheld. Below my picture here is Tara Osinski, no relation. Tara's a 6th grade science teacher. She's also taught 7th grade at middle school in Nashua. Tara, how long have you been teaching?
5 years, and I'm also a parent to a 5th grader and soon to be 2nd grader.
Okay, so you view this from a couple of angles.
Yes.
And that's really important. Rich Deepantima is at the bottom screen. Wave for us, Rich. Rich has a long career in public health, having run a public health agency in rural Connecticut, been the city of Manchester public health officer, been the deputy chief of epidemiology for the state of New Hampshire, now retired and running for state rep in Portsmouth. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Because you don't have enough to do.
No, just something to keep me busy between pandemics.
And last is Elizabeth Dalton, who's joining us with a background in analytics and remote learning. And so Elizabeth's going to add perhaps a more technical overview of remote learning for us, coming to us from her home office in Barrington. So let me get us all started by framing the issue. We're all concerned about the implications of the pandemic and the danger of spreading the COVID-19 virus. At the same time, we have our responsibility to school children to provide educational opportunities, to do it safely, to be mindful of social and emotional issues that sometimes are better addressed when we're together as opposed to separated in remote learning. How do we accommodate all of those interests, do it safely? We're doing it, from my perspective, in the context of a school funding system that is grossly unfair to many districts. And the governor's put forward a plan that basically puts each school district off on its own with insufficient resources. Some districts will be able to accommodate, others will not. And how do we as a state address that? From my perspective, we should be coordinating our efforts, and the state should be setting minimum standards as to how we approach this and providing resources to allow us to implement those minimum standards. So let me just ask from your various perspectives, and I'm glad Tara has both teaching and parental perspectives for us to address. How should we even be viewing the question of reopening, and what are the important concerns that we should be thinking about? And just help the people who are participating. There are 53 on this Zoom, and there are more on Facebook. How should we be analyzing the questions before us? And let me, because I think the public health concerns are so foremost in most of our minds. Let's start with Richard and give us something of a public health overview of bringing children and educators and other school staff together in school buildings.
Yeah, sure, certainly. First of all, we're all dealing with something that we've never had an experience with before, with a pandemic 102 years ago. So none of us had to deal with this, even though I've seen pictures of the 1918 pandemic with classrooms being taught outside in New York. You could see the New York skyline in the background and children with masks sitting outdoors with blackboards and the teacher out there. But in the general sense, I want to say, first of all, you can't look at the school opening issue in isolation with the rest of the entire pandemic response. It has to be all looked at as a whole. And the school opening thing is just one piece of that. So, part of this whole reopening thing is we need to think about how do we first and foremost stop community transmission on the broader level before we even allow kids to start back into school. And what's really missing in this whole equation is the lack of a statewide mandate to wear face coverings in public buildings, public stores, et cetera, et cetera. That is the first thing you need to do in order to stop and reduce community transmission. And once you start to reduce community transmission to where you're getting almost to the R zeros, then it's going to be a lot safer to open up your schools because you're going to have much fewer potential for kids who are infected attending schools, much fewer potential for teachers and staff who might be infected attending schools. So the whole premise here is you need to look at it from a big, broad perspective before you even think about opening up the schools. And once you start opening up the schools, then you have to look at what are the opportunities you have for different methods of teaching these kids. What can be done outdoors? What can be done distance-wise? How do you stagger different classrooms and different grade groups? How many days a week do children have to attend schools? How many hours do they have to attend the schools? What are you going to do about lunches and meals? Because it's going to be very difficult to wear masks and to social distance during those kinds of periods. What are you going to do about transportation and getting kids to school on buses in terms of social distancing? What kind of supervision is there going to be on the buses to make sure the kids follow all the guidelines and requirements that are going to be put in place in terms of social distancing and masking? So there's a whole array, and I don't pretend to know all of the issues. I'm not an educator, but I'm a public health person. But I know there's a whole array of issues that need to be considered so we can put kids in a safe environment so they can learn, they can have socialization, but so they don't get sick, they don't get the virus, bring it home to their parents and grandparents and the wider community.
Thanks, Rich. Tara, can we go to you? And I want to give you a chance to answer the overall question, but there's a supplement. So I've been reading how our education commissioner, Frank Edelblue, has been saying, don't use masks for kids because it'll cause them to touch their faces even more, and you can't really supervise children wearing masks. So based on your teaching experience and your parental experience, I'd like you also to talk about that. But first, the overall question.
Okay, so thinking about the overall question, I agree with Richard that we really need to frame it in terms of the entire community. So when we reopen schools, it's not just the school children that attend school we need to think about, but it's all of our community members and what that might mean in terms of transmission. I also agree, really looking at what's been successful in other countries. Countries that have been able to reopen schools without large outbreaks have had really strong contact tracing. They have very low community transmission, and they're really doing it in a progressive fashion. So they're not bringing in everybody at once. I think all of those things really need to be considered. I agree that we need some baseline recommendations across the board. I do think that masks do need to be required if we are to open schools, though I'm not sure that that's the best path to go down at this point. I think it is going to be a challenge for some of our kiddos to follow proper wearing of masks, not just the younger ones, but we do have a lot of students who might have some behavioral challenges and things like that, especially at the middle school level where fitting in and sort of peer pressure is so important. So I don't want to say that kids can't do it, because I think we don't give our kids enough credit sometimes for the things that they can do. And I know with my own kids, my 7-year-old is really awesome about wearing his mask, and he can do it appropriately and properly for short periods of time. I'm not sure how longer periods of time, what that might look like. So I think really we need to be thinking about school reopening within the context of the community, what our students can do, having some of those baseline protocols, and then really also thinking about consistency and routine for our students. So we don't want to kind of be going from one method to the other, because I feel like that's going to be really less effective. So jumping from in class to remote is difficult. I know at home with my boys, once we got in the groove of remote teaching and then remote teaching myself, once we were a couple months in, I was a much stronger remote teacher. We had really good communication, and we kind of had a system both at home and with my students. So I think that's going to be an important consideration as we look at reopening schools: consistency, looking at the whole view of the community, what other public health things are in place. Do we have testing? What's the turnaround on testing? I know because of the outbreak in other states, our own testing has been delayed, and we're affected by that. So we don't live in a bubble. Our numbers are good right now, but again, we don't live in a bubble. So we need to be considering all of those factors, and we want to keep them that way. The other thing I'd really like us to consider too is looking at that academic engagement piece. So we know that we do have some students who don't have the best situations at home, and we want to make sure that we have some supports for those students to be engaged, and kind of thinking about some community partners that we might, if we do go with a remote or a hybrid option, how can we support those high risk students is going to be really important. And then in terms of what a class might look like, I think it's going to be difficult for us to really use those wonderful strategies that we know promote learning with our kids under the conditions that would make it safe. So having that remote option, and I'm sure Ms. Dalton can kind of speak to some of the different technological platforms for collaboration, things like that. With remote learning, we might be able to do some more of the engaging strategies, the socially connected strategies from afar rather than in person, because it's not going to be safe. So those are just kind of an overview of my thoughts as we take a look at this.
That's great. Thank you. So let's go to Elizabeth. Again, address the overall question as you'd like, but I am interested in the question of how to make remote learning more effective for more kids. And in particular, I've been talking about how we may have a short reopening session where we're together, and can we use that effectively to then make remote learning more effective? So can we, in essence, train ourselves to do better at remote learning, to get closer to being on the same page? I know we can't bring everyone to the same level of effectiveness because homes are so different and children's skills are so different. But let me give you the opportunity to respond to the big question, but also maybe start us a little bit on the question of can we use 5 weeks, 6 weeks to be better prepared for going 100% remote?
Well, I certainly agree with what other people have said about the school being part of a community. And that cuts both ways. The people around the community affect the school affects what's going on with the community, not just educationally, but also in terms of health and attitudes and everything else. And that also really highlights differences in kids' homes in terms of what kind of parental support is available, whether they've got a quiet space to work, whether they've got a technology platform, a tablet or some kind of laptop or a phone. How are they connecting? How are they doing their distance ed? I used to work for a company called Moodle, which was started by a guy who did his K through 12 on Australia's School of the Air. He lived in the outback in Australia, and he went on to develop the online software using that experience and thinking, how can we help people be connected as humans, as learning humans, and build learning communities using all of the kinds of technologies that we have and the knowledge that we have about people. So technology is not the answer. Technology is a tool. The community is the answer. So what we want to try to do is use the technologies that we have to maintain those communities. And I think I always stress that when somebody asks me a question about technology, because I don't want to be trying to say, oh yeah, all we need to do is put a computer in everyone's home and make sure the internet is connected. And those kinds of things may be necessary, but they're not sufficient. So part of what I would do in those first 6 weeks, if we have them, is get kids to start thinking about learning contracts and take ownership of their learning. They're going to have to do a lot more on their own than they have had to do before. We have a model of teaching in this country largely that depends on a captive audience. The students have to go, they have to sit in their desks, they can be penalized if they don't. And I know that the best teachers, those of you who are on this call, don't just sit your students in rows and lecture at them all day. We're past the factory model. But we still kind of assume that they have to do what we want on our schedule. When they go home, that's not how it's going to work, because things happen at home. Now it's time to go to lunch. Now it's time to walk the dog. Now it's time to help mom. Now it's time for mom to help me. So I've taught online. My college-age kids have learned online. I've worked with younger kids in face-to-face settings in a community Chinese school, actually. And some things, the real struggle is to try to get the kids motivated enough to manage their own schedules. We call that metacognitive strategies, being able to manage their own learning. That's what we need to focus on when we're face-to-face with them. Get them engaged in some long-term projects that they actually care about. They'll learn the other stuff on the way. If they get really interested in what kind of bugs live in my house, they will end up reading and they will end up doing math, and they will end up coming up with some really interesting stuff that they can then share with their peers, get feedback from their teachers, and it will motivate them because they chose it. So that's the kind of thing that I think we can do to make the most use of that face-to-face time if we do get it. And that can carry us forward so that we put things like the online activities, the worksheets, the quizzes, the websites that we send our kids to, like Khan Academy or whatever, we put those in service to some learning objectives that the kids had a hand in choosing. It'll vary based on the age of the kids. You need a lot more short projects with little kids. The first time I taught preschool, I went in with my list of activities and ran out 20 minutes into the session because they just didn't have the focus to do one activity for as long as I was thinking. So you need more activities. You need a little more turnover and a little more bringing them back to focus. The other thing that I'd like us to think about is how the kids can help each other in learning groups. And these don't have to be based on the school district. So if my kid likes bugs and Tara's kid also likes bugs, they don't have to be in the same school district. They can be part of a learning group. And the teachers and the parents can be part of helping to moderate that and keep it safe. And kind of keep things a little focused. So I, as a member of the community, would be willing to be a mentor in a group like that. And I'm willing to have you check my background before you put me in touch with any kids. But let's get some more adults, maybe who don't have little ones at home. Mine are college age and graduated. Let's get some more adults involved to get a little more one-on-one so that we can do those three pieces: engaging with the content, engaging with each other as students, and engaging with the teachers or mentors. We can make use of our technology to do that and make it stronger, and maybe even come up with some better ideas that will carry forward into schools once we're able to get back together again. The last thing I'll say about a different kind of technology, masks and sanitary. I've been doing a lot of reading. I have a statistical background, a science background, so I can read the peer-reviewed journal articles about what kinds of fabrics work and, you know, whether you can wash masks. And I think a combination of masks and face shields may end up being the way to go. And for our really little ones, face shields may be better. They can see each other's faces. It's hard to wear them wrong, and it can be hard to wear a mask correctly. And they provide very good protection for the wearer, not quite as much protection against aerosols and not quite as much protection for the others, which is why physicians wear both of them in high-risk situations. But we might want to consider some balances like that. We might want to consider plexiglass screens where they're appropriate, lightweight face shields where they're appropriate, lightweight masks. I'm experimenting with masks that have an inner layer of a thin silk that can hold a static charge. One of the things that makes the disposable PPE so effective is that they're made of a substance that carries a static charge and traps small particles. But if you wash them, that goes away. We can work on that. And we could do that as a homegrown effort here in New Hampshire and be a leader in that regard. We can share with other states. But let's start to think of some creative solutions that will be more comfortable for our teachers and our kids to wear and help us follow the rules. Help us be safe and try to be consistent. If we're all doing it together, then even our 7th graders will do it. If everybody has to wear a mask to school, then everybody wears one. And even the peer pressure will start to help us. If it's, well, it's advised, well, we know where that's going to go.
Yeah, and other states have adopted mask wearing or facial covering.
And other countries have done it, and it has done very well. Yeah.
Right. And so it's part of it's a matter of becoming enculturated.
Yeah.
To do it in the context of the pandemic. So I don't want to leave out Amanda, who has
Sorry, Amanda.
as teacher and school board chair. One thing I'd like to add for you, Amanda, is do we necessarily have to have the same strategy for all grade levels in our school district? So maybe we take a different approach with K to 5 and a different approach 6 to 9, and the most senior kids, maybe we have yet a different approach. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Have the senior kids help teach. Sorry, go on, Amanda.
So we've, I also have 2 high schoolers, 2 that have graduated, and I'll have a freshman and a junior in the fall. So I want them to go to school. I want to go to school. I teach music. It's really challenging to do that online. I certainly can't do it in a group setting because the technology doesn't work the same in each home, and there are time lapses. I have found success working one-on-one with students throughout since March. In fact, I'm still teaching remotely right now at the present with students who wanted to continue over the summer, and it works well with that particular cohort because they're really engaged and they're really driven to become better at this instrumental skill that they're working on. I don't see a scenario currently where we could put, for example, at Dover High School, where we can safely say we're going to put roughly 1,400 students and all of the staff in the building at the same time and start school. I think it would be really irresponsible. I do see scenarios where students will be present in the building, but it will be rotating through some kind of hybrid in the building so that we have that contact with our students and also learning online. And whether that learning online is live or it happens later to accommodate a particular student schedule. You know, I'm thinking high school students, they have jobs. And high school students working in the food industry right now have become pretty critical, even in the daytime hours. So how do we balance that for those businesses? A hybrid schedule, I think, would work best for the older students at this point. I mean, clearly the best situation is school as we would anticipate in the fall, like we started last year, but that's not a realistic expectation at this point. What is realistic is keeping constant contact physically and remotely, and perhaps it's different for different age groups. You know, some schools might work with half days, 5 days a week. Some schools, some students might work better going in 2 days a week and being remote 2 days a week, and having that 5th day is an opportunity to touch base with your teacher and to perhaps meet in a small group or meet one-on-one and get those questions answered. We know that there are students who really did do well with remote instruction, that they thrived. And part of that was because they didn't have that self-consciousness about asking questions in front of their peers. They didn't have to worry about needing longer time to, I'm sorry, my dogs are barking, needing longer time to process new information because they could process it at their own speed. And I think that while it's been very challenging, and I like to refer to what we did in the fall now as emergency learning, not remote learning, because I think remote learning would be different if we had time to prepare for it like we do now.
Yeah.
Emergency learning was keeping everyone going. And now we need to look at how do we remote learn and how is that going to change education as we move forward? Because with the accessibility of remote learning, we've opened up a lot of options to a lot of families. And I do just want to say that in Dover, we are fortunate that through a bunch of different circumstances, we are able to go to one-to-one devices beginning in the next academic year. It was not something previously that was attainable for us, and it became essential in order for us to continue to educate the 4,000 students in the city of Dover. Did I cover everything, Andy?
You did just fine. I'd give you an A.
Thank you.
Can I just, I'll come back to you, Elizabeth. I don't want to lose this point of staggering attendance and having safe spaces in terms of air exchange and social distancing. And so let me go to Rich real quickly on that. Well, it doesn't have to be quick. We have 488 school buildings in New Hampshire. Because I've done so much work on school funding, I've been in many of them. Many of them are more than 50 years old. Some were built without air exchange in mind, and some have had so much deferral of maintenance of HVAC systems that who knows what condition the mechanicals are in. So how important is that? And I was struck by your comment about the 1918 photo of the teaching out of doors. I think we may want to do a lot to encourage that in this early fall time period. So let me give you the
Yeah,
floor.
I think the issue of indoor air quality, particularly in schools, has been a problem in New Hampshire for many, many years. Um, Part of that is due to the energy crisis that we had in the 70s and 80s, where a lot of school districts, in order to conserve energy, basically did a lot of things to tighten up their buildings and actually reduce the amount of air exchanges that take place in buildings. And for many years, I was involved in investigating problems with the sick building syndrome, was where we had children getting sick and teachers getting sick because of the poor air quality in these buildings. The typical sick building syndrome type of illness. And then we had various respiratory disease outbreaks that took place in schools, and part of that was because of the poor air exchanges. So that's a very difficult process to undo at this point. You need to look at what structures you have in place and how you can modify them very quickly. But also, I think the most important piece is going to be to limit the amount of people in a building at any given time, so you can maximize your air exchanges and maximize the amount of fresh air that you get into the buildings, either opening windows if you can, opening doors if you can. And of course, we have that unfortunate security issue where we have to worry about, beside the security, some lunatic coming in with a gun, so we have all those old situations that we have to be aware of at the same time as we want to do outdoor learning, if possible, for as long as we can, staggering the number of students in the building at any given time, limiting the number of classrooms that are being occupied at any given time. And of course, I think eliminating or even using maybe some of your gymnasiums and some of the larger spaces for some learning where you could spread out people a lot more than you can in a smaller classroom. So I think we have to be creative, and things that we've never thought about before, we're going to have to start thinking about. And we need to look at what's being done in other countries and in other states and learn from those experiences. We don't live in an isolated world. What works in one place may very well work here. So let's be open-minded and look at what's happening in Taiwan and what's happening in South Korea and other places, in Italy, and see what we can learn from those experiences. And I don't think we've done a very good job in this country learning from the experiences of other countries.
So how complicated is it to test for airflow and air exchange?
It's not very complicated. You need somebody with a little bit of an HVAC background. They can monitor the flow using velometers, very handheld gadgets you can hold up to to the ventilation systems. You can monitor the number of air exchanges that take place in the building. That's not very complicated. People can do that very easily. So it's just a matter of having the funds available at the local level to pay for that kind of service.
And having an interest in getting to the answer, which...
Yes, yeah, because when you ask the question, you want to know before you ask the question, you want to know what you want to do with the answer. Yeah, that's important.
Well, there are a number of us that want that answer to make safety decisions.
Yep.
I think, Elizabeth, you wanted to jump in on the issue of remote learning sometimes fitting a child's learning style better than the more typical in-person classroom.
Yeah, I think all of the other teachers on this call probably can attest to this as well. I've taught extensively online at the college level, younger and older students. And I've also watched my kids deal with online learning. And it is definitely true that the system that we had, all classroom learning, advantages some students more than others, just as remote learning advantages some students more than others. So when we talk about remote learning not being as good or being a substitute, probably we should give a little more thought to that, because we've made some assumptions that what we had was the gold standard. And in fact, for some kids who are more introverted, more self-motivated learners, certain kinds of non-neurotypical students, they really thrive in a more self-directed online environment, or an environment that gives them a little more time to think about something before they react or before they participate. So before we assume that we're trying to make up deficiencies, let's also look at strengths.
I did not intend to imply that one was better than the other, but our model was school-based, and from a Sunday afternoon to a Monday morning in March, we learned that we were switching from one model to the next. And
Yep.
to me, it didn't matter which direction you were going in, you were going to experience chaos with the absence of any preparation. So
I think the remark about emergency learning was very on point.
Yes. So it's so funny for me to see teachers raising their hands. Good work. Go ahead, Tara.
I'm really excited when Elizabeth was talking earlier about some of the different opportunities that we could have to really engage the community. So I think that there's a lot of people concerned that our students are going to fall behind. And I just want to remind families out there, first of all, this is temporary. There's a lot of promising information coming out about vaccines and treatments, and every day we're learning something new. We're learning more about how COVID affects us and how to treat it. So it is temporary, and everybody across the world is kind of in the same situation. So how do we find the positives in the situation that we're in and make it work for our kids and our family and our community? And I think Elizabeth really spoke very well about engaging those community partners. So how can we come together to maybe help support some of our parents who might have more difficulty being home with their kids? Also thinking about the different needs, like Amanda had mentioned. So maybe we're doing what they did in some countries, which is bring back primary students in very small pods for a shortened amount of time so they can have some of that social interaction. With the older kids, remote learning and teaching in the spring, I really felt like remote learning did a couple really strong points. And one was building those family connections. So never before have I had as strong family connections as I did in the fall. And I have a team of about 100 students, but just being able to reach out and I was giving out my phone number by the end, and families would call if they had a question, or they'd send a remind, and I could be there, set up a Zoom, help a kid right away, one-on-one. So a lot of our students were getting attention that they may not have gotten in the classroom. So I really thought that was kind of a benefit that I'd like to see continue forward. And again, that opportunity for individual study and differentiation is really there with online learning. So there's a ton of flexibility. And if we collaborate with our colleagues, we can really, and I know one of the comments on the side talked about collaborating with some of our higher learning institutions to see what has worked successfully for them. In the state, we have the Virtual Learning Academy charter school that we could partner with. Many of our district teachers work there. So we could find out, how they structure things to be successful for students. So I think there are a lot of things that we can learn from. And just keeping in mind that it is a temporary situation. And I think the number one thing needs to be safety of the community, and then growth to really support our students and families using a number of different strategies.
But Amanda, if you want to jump in, feel free. But wearing your school board chair hat, what flexibility do you really have? If Dover were to decide we can't open safely, we're just going to stay remote, does our state's Department of Education give you that option?
That is an interesting question, because we would be continuing schooling, but closing the buildings. And the board would have to vote to extend that beyond, I believe, 5 days. It might be 10 days. The superintendent has that authority. And then the board would have to vote beyond that amount. I actually hadn't thought about that. And without any recommendations or guidelines, let's say Dover has had cases, but say we're in a smaller town, there's been no reported cases in our town, but we also know that we're a touristy location, so we're going to have travelers. Labor Day weekend, what if we don't want to start school until we know that it hasn't come to our community? Having some assistance from the state on those kinds of questions would have been a tremendous help for all of us. I do believe that the local community is what really influences the outcomes in our local schools. That if as a community of adults, we say it's in all of our best interests that when we're in a store, when we're in a public building, when we're at school, when we're on public transportation, we're wearing masks and we're washing or using hand sanitizer when we leave that location and move on to another location. That if we accept that that is our new norm, and we as parents don't make an issue of it and accept that we're all just going to do it, then it doesn't become an issue anymore. And that's a huge debate. Should we wear masks? Shouldn't we wear masks? I mean, I feel like we couldn't possibly have a family dinner with extended family at this point, because we'd have the maskers and the anti-maskers, and then, what's going to happen to the family harmony? But there are students in all age groups that need that contact, not just on a screen. They need to see and hear another adult live, or to see their friends, whether or not, you can hug them. I work with kids as young as 5, as old as, well, if my adult choir counts, then, 105. There's some that just want that physical connection.
Yeah.
How do we get around that? And I know in our own family experience, we actually have 3 school districts in our home. So navigating that will be an interesting issue for us. My husband is also an educator and he teaches in Manchester. So we have 3 spread out school districts. How do we manage if there's an outbreak at my husband's school, but not in Dover or Stratford? And providing a place for children to go when their parents must go to work. I don't know how we balance it all. I do know that there are families who have said, I can't work remotely in the fall. What am I going to do with my child?
Right.
And we need help from the state. We need some guidance. We need some opportunities in order to make sure that all of our children are cared for.
Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that point. I was a deputy public health officer in Manchester, and we had all the school nurses in Manchester work for the health department. So I'm acutely aware of all the issues that took place in the schools, and we have a collateral public health issue beside the pandemic associated with closing schools and distance learning. In Manchester, we had a huge refugee population and a large population of non-English speaking students. So we have to think about how do we accommodate students that don't have the resources, and English is a second language issue. Plus, many of the students, their health care and their nutrition was basically obtained from attending school. They'd get breakfast and lunches at schools, and a lot of their health care was obtained at the schools. So, and this is all being cast aside now with the pandemic, but those are issues that we're going to have to incorporate into all of the discussions about schools opening and how do we accommodate kids. We can't think of just typical what we consider middle class white New Hampshire. We have to think about some of the issues relative to places like Manchester, even Portsmouth and Nashua and other places where we have populations that are not what would be considered typical New Hampshire populations.
Well, there's a related issue that I became aware of because of my schoolwork, and that is that children would be referred to the authorities for investigation of abuse, and they would at times become homeschoolers because that cut off the contact between the child and the school authority. And this has become a constant topic of discussion at the Executive Council where I sit. My colleague Ted Gatzis usually raises the issue of how do we know that children are being safe if they're not in contact with objective third-party adults. Now, that's a modest percentage of the children, but it's not insignificant. We need to be aware of that. Tara, go ahead.
You're going to respond to the same kind of idea and what Richard was talking about. In Nashville, we have a community, a very diverse community with all different needs. And I know special education has been raised in the chat as well. And I think we need a dynamic plan. So we really need to think about, we do have some students that might need those in-person supports. One of my sons has an IEP. He actually did really well with remote learning. So it might work for some kids and it might not for others. But how do we ensure that some of our high-risk kids, whether it's due to a learning disability or just that support at home, how are they getting what they need? And one of the things I think that many of our districts did well is continuing to provide those services to our families that need it when it came to nutrition. But I think we need more of a wraparound support for our high-risk families. I think we need more social workers really with this, and maybe developing a system that brings in some of those high-risk kids without bringing everybody in small groups to get the support that they need. And if there's one thing that this pandemic has shown the community, I think teachers have always known this, is that our schools provide so much more than a place to learn. They are so essential. You know, healthcare, nutrition, clothing. Our students get so much out of our schools. So how do we engage the community to make up for those needs? I think we really need to reflect on that.
That's a really good point. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, the resources for our students around mental health and other social issues are so sparse that our current staff, I think in most, if not all school buildings, is just maxed out. And wait lists for counseling and outside therapy are excruciatingly long, when sometimes it's an immediate issue. We have been working in Dover. Our Mental Health Alliance was formed. Unfortunately, we had suicides in consecutive years in our class of 2022. And I'm attending a webinar next week on mental health, because that's the piece that you can't really pick up on so well in a remote conversation or in an email. But when you see a student face to face and have a conversation, there are cues that you can pick up on. I do have to say that I had concerns about a couple of my students during remote learning, and sent off an email to the school counselor and got an immediate response. And those students had check-ins, and in some ways that remote experience again allowed those kids to feel like it was okay to reach out and ask for a little bit of support, that they might be embarrassed to say, excuse me, Miss Smith, can I go to the school counselor's office, please? Because I'm just having an issue. But we can all make that socially acceptable as well. We've all got issues. If we just own them and work our best to get control over them, then we're all doing ourselves a favor. Yeah.
I think that's a great
Thank
point.
you.
We were mentioning as we were getting ready to start that my son is a 7th grade science teacher. I should mention that my daughter just finished 5 years as a high school social worker in New York City. So a lot of the issues you're talking about, she was one of a couple of social workers staffing a social work office in a very large urban high school, and encountered a lot of non-learning related issues.
Yeah.
And we don't do enough around mental health for schools. I do want to, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. I want to give a shout out to Matt Bean, who's from Claremont, who's both a para-educator and a home support mentor. And we may need a lot more of that if we're going to stay in this model. We're about 12 minutes left in our forum. One thing I want to throw out, but we can go anywhere you want, is I think we may be looking at a scenario where we open briefly, go fully remote, open briefly again, go remote again, and that for a couple of years, we're in a model where we're doing essentially month-long check-ins in a school facility and then leaving again. And if that is the case, I'd love your thoughts on whether that can work. Of course, we need to renegotiate all of the teacher contracts and all of the support staff contracts. I don't want to slight that. I do want to say that as far as my thinking on COVID and educators, we need to create a presumption in law that if you work in a school and you get COVID-19, you are presumed to have caught it at school. Similar to the presumption that exists for firefighters with lung cancer. If you come down with cancer and you're a firefighter, you don't have to prove that it came from your work. We should have the same for school personnel. But what about this idea of in again, out again, remote, in person, and is anything happening with outdoor education, physically being outdoor?
You know, we do live in a state with winter.
I'm well aware, although it's not been so bad lately. But go ahead, Tara.
Advantage here, the global warming.
Yeah. In a district our size, I think that outdoor learning, it would probably be somewhat difficult. I would love to see it. I mean, I'm a strong believer in being out in nature and learning, field experience, all of those things. But I think that that would be somewhat of a challenge. So I think that could be a solution to maybe developing those essential relationships in the beginning of the year. But I worry about going from one to another as both a parent and a teacher. I'm much more in favor of something that is going to be consistent, and then thinking about perhaps smaller, safer ways we could bring groups of students together to support those social emotional needs of our students. So thinking about maybe delivery of remote instruction, but then there might be some extracurriculars that students could do on a voluntary basis. So families could go if they're comfortable. Adults who are comfortable could run those programs. It's much easier to socially distance if it's a shorter amount of time, those types of things, and everybody's very clear about what the expectations are. So I think we can really, really be creative in meeting those needs of our students, because I don't want to say that those are less important, but ultimately I think we just have to put safety first. And really it's not worth losing one child over, or adult. We got to protect the community.
I absolutely agree, Tara, that whether we're remote, whether it's hybrid, whatever the scenario is, that those extracurriculars, because they are voluntary, those need to happen. Districts have already budgeted for stipends for those items. So whether or not the NHIAA permits a fall sports season to occur, those teams, should those students and their families want them to participate in training, should be training. Mm-hmm. They should be getting that physical activity, because fall sports are primarily outdoor sports. Getting together in groups that are deemed safe. The state has allowed workout groups to start happening, and have that contact with other people. I think especially if we're in a remote situation, that becomes critical. And I agree, whatever system we initiate, I think we need to stick with for a while. Mm-hmm. I do think we have to have some in-person contact at the start of the year. And because everyone's getting new groups of children, and you haven't had a time to form a relationship yet, So having that opportunity to meet in small groups, to build those relationships so that when you are working remotely, you can get through that. But a system, and my suspicion is hybrid is probably going to be where a lot of us land, but it needs to be consistent for a long period of time because we're so out of routine. And we all know that routine is critical.
Yeah.
I think, the issue of how we address this, the virus is going to have a lot to say about this and the epidemiology of the virus. If we start seeing spikes in certain communities and then other, numbers start to increase dramatically, that's going to change what we're doing and how we're doing it. So what we think we might be able to do now, based on what we're seeing with the virus, may not be what we're going to be able to do 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now. And that's going to be constantly evolving as this pandemic changes. So we need to, understand that this is not a process that we can make a decision that we say, okay, we're going to do distance learning for 4 weeks, and then we're going to go to in school for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. The virus will have something to say about that and how we respond to the virus.
Fair comment. Elizabeth, you had your hand raised.
I was thinking especially the teachers in the field have been talking, that if we acknowledge that the social contact is necessary for the kids, that it's part of their development, let's make the most use that we can of the face-to-face time on that social contact. If we have kids in classes, don't sit them down at desks and ask them to do seat work. Make the absolute most we can of every bit of face-to-face time that we get safely. Because the worksheets can be done whenever. And I'm not saying that academic subjects aren't important. I'm just saying, because I really believe they are, but the way of working heads down, focusing on a task, we can do that when we're not face-to-face, and we'll do it better. So let's balance the environment.
Good point. There's a portion of the governor's guidance that talks about desks facing front 6 feet apart. That was my childhood nightmare. I almost flunked 3rd grade because I couldn't do it.
And you'd have to find an elementary school that had desks.
Right. Most of us don't have desks anymore. It's tables, it's collaborative,
Right.
or the idea of live streaming is just, that's not how a classroom works. So.
Yes, but it was nightmarish for me to read that, subjecting today's children to that. Tara, are you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I think we all long to go back to the school that we kind of knew, right, with engaging our students together, but that's not the school that we'll necessarily go back to. Really, it is, like you said, your worst nightmare. When you read what the protocols would be, it's going to be in your desk. I'm going to have to be 6 feet away trying to help a kid. It would be much easier, I think, to support them through Zoom, where we can have that close face-to-face. I can share my screen. So we long to be back with our students, all teachers do. I just worry about what that instruction would look like in person, and whether, again, is that worth the risk, because it's not the school that we miss.
So we have just a couple of minutes. So let me offer an opportunity for final thoughts from everyone. Let me first say thank you. Because this has been really informative. The chat has been blowing up on the side. Lots of great comments, lots of good questions. We've tried to pick up some of those questions, but final thoughts on how we do any of this,
Patience.
says the teacher. That's great. Yeah.
We're all in territory that we've not experienced before, from teachers to students to administrators to families. I think we can and will do better in the fall than we did in March, because in March we reacted and now we can actually respond. We can take the time to think things through. Actually, the table I'm sitting at right now, I have notepads everywhere, where throughout the course of remote instruction or emergency instruction, I would have an idea and I'd write it down and say, if I'm going back to this, I'm going to do it better. And here's what I can use, the tool that I can use to make it a better experience for all of us.
Great point. Go ahead, Tara.
I have 3 words to kind of move us forward. So grace, so giving each other kind of grace as we try new things and that flexibility. Resiliency, our kids are resilient. We will get through this. They're going to learn no matter what. They're going to learn valuable life lessons. You know, we frame it for them, and we have the power as parents and educators to make this something that they can take something and carry with it for the rest of their life. And then also community. I think more than ever, that sense of community, even though we're physically apart, we need to be partnering and working together. So I believe in New Hampshire. I believe in the strength of our community. And I know that we will get through this. I just want everyone to get through it safely.
Say your 3 words again.
Grace, resiliency, and community.
Thank you. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Oh boy, how would I follow that up? Creativity. In using all of the tools and the knowledge and the connections that we have to come up with new ways of doing the stuff that we know we care about. Data. There are tools that we can use to help us gather data about what's working and help us make better predictions and notice better when our students need help or our teachers need help. And I work for a company that works on that, but there are, you know, it's not just one company. And honesty. Look at ourselves in the mirror and say, why do we want to reopen schools? Is it because we need to go back to work and we don't have any place to put our kids? Then let's solve that problem. Let's be really honest about which problems we're trying to solve and what the best ways are to solve those problems, not just assume that we're going to go back to something that's just like what we used to have because it met all these needs. It might be time to unpack things, look at our needs honestly, and think about how to address them in the best way that we can right now, for now.
Richard.
I guess my final word would be science. Science is what's going to get us through this, not politics, not anything else. It's going to be science and public health, because if we first things first is to control the virus. Once you control the virus, then you can start opening up schools, you can open up businesses, you can open up everything else. So focus on science and public health, and the rest will follow.
Can't top any of those. So thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your being here. Thanks everyone for watching and for submitting questions and comments. Be safe out there. Take good care. And grace, resiliency, and community. I love it. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.